Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about how do we not die tonight. It wasn't just a season. It was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this. You're living in a tiny mud and stick hut with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows, unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin, and definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered pathetically, doing its best, mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a couple of rough-spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hopeless faith that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it didn't really work. Forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure. And bonus, some fleas for extra company. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, and honestly worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure, it was just beginning. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, it was always readily available, shall we say. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And peasants, they were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground, so technically you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled close to each other. Human insulation at its finest. Creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only thing standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was falling apart and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of, if your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home. Maybe if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. Make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted back away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw, into your bones, and straight into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations. It was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor if you could afford it. Or more realistically, if you could steal enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting caught, you might have a decent insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast, got moldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often, they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames, packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold, radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No fireplace with a fancy stone mantel. No neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right. Most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing or your overall lifespan, but on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea. It was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty. Stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters? Dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love, whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to child, like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some said, use dry ash only. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight. Others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway. Or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals. Basically, the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory right there. And enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more the merrier," wasn't just about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth. Each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was don't wake up frozen to the floor. entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So, next time your sibling steals your blanket, or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. Guarding them with the warmest spot was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cozy, basking by the flames. Too close, and you might wake with singed hair, or a cloak quietly smoldering. Too far, and you were essentially camping in an icebox. It was a delicate choreography. Stay near enough to drink in the glow, yet not so near that you had to explain why you now resembled a half-roasted supper. Heat didn't spread kindly either. It mostly blistered the folks seated right in front, while everyone else wrestled over a skinny cone of warmth like chilled lizards jostling for a sliver of sun. If you drifted off facing the blaze, you might enjoy one blissfully toasty side, and one so frozen you could practically knock on it. Animals muscled in, of course. A dog would wedge itself between you and the hearth, tail swishing perilously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes teetered on the hearthstones, clucking like tiny feathered guardians of heat. Every crackle, every shifting ember was a small promise. You're alive. You're warm for now. And so they slipped into uneasy sleep, lulled by pops and hisses, each breath puffing little clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't comfortable. But it was life clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one weathered winter alone, unless they fancied becoming a very fashionable ice sculpture by January. Survival wasn't merely a family matter. It was a village enterprise, a noisy, muddy, improvised collaboration where everyone's warmth and life hinged on everyone else. People knew that in the depths of winter, a strong hearth and a heap of hay only went so far. If a neighbor's house fell dark, you noticed. If old Tom's smoke stopped curling into the sky, someone went to look in. Not only because Tom owed you a chicken, though that fact lingered, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, the young or the elderly, who couldn't plow fields, but could note who was coughing too hard, who hadn't bartered at market in days, or whose cottage looked too still under morning frost. They were the medieval neighborhood. Patrolled no reflective vests, many more sheep. If a family's fire died, it bordered on emergency. A good neighbor hurried over with a wrapped live coal, or opened their own smoky, crowded hut for the night. Yes, it It meant squeezing 4 extra bodies into a cramped space, but it beat discovering frozen friends at thaw. Communal stores mattered too. In brutal seasons, villages pooled the last salted meat, the grain, the dried veg. It was grim charity. No one had much, but a few shared meals could decide who staggered into spring. Even children grasped the stakes. They hauled wood, shared embers, and sprinted urgent messages when help was needed. No one was too small or too tired when winter knocked. Quarrels didn't vanish. Disputes over land, goats, or the good cooking pot simmered on, but deadly cold shelved old grudges. A rival was still worth saving. Tomorrow it might be you. In winter's icy heart, the village became one stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often funny, always fierce about surviving together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When peasants faced winter's merciless bite, they didn't only layer cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed. When the wind howled like wolves outside paper-thin walls, and the blaze shrank to sullen embers, you wanted every edge, including divine help. Faith wasn't a Sunday hobby. It threaded through every frosted breath. Before burrowing under straw and scratchy wool, families knelt and offered quick prayers. Keep the fire alive, the roof sound, the toes attached by morning. Saints weren't distant icons. They were frontline winter allies. Saint Blaise was invoked for throats. No small thing when one gulp of icy air could set you coughing up your soul. Saint Nicholas wasn't just a later legend's gift giver. He was asked to protect households from sudden ruin in lean months. Superstitions tucked themselves snug around daily life. Some sprinkled holy water near the hearth before bed to ward off evil, or at least mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way in. Candles mattered, too. Vigil lights blessed by priest or by the village's most devout grandmother sometimes burned all night, a flickering plea against clawing dark. And there were promises. Lord, get us through this night, and I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one nicking our turnips. Faith wasn't abstract comfort. It was an urgent, daily conversation. They weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food. One more day until spring loosened winter's grip. Hope fragile, stubborn, was whispered into smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked beneath itchy blankets, somehow carrying them through merciless nights. For all their ingenuity, prayers, and grit, the truth was stark. Sometimes winter won, and when it did, it didn't claim a few unfortunate souls. It swallowed families, even villages, into silence beneath snow and ice. Some seasons were especially vicious. The Great Famine winter of 1315, when rains wrecked crops, livestock starved, and freezing cold turned hard lives into slow catastrophe. Desperation spread. People were said to chew shoe leather, bark, and in the darkest whispers each other. Letting the hearth die wasn't a nuisance. It was often a death sentence. Without that thin thread of heat, families huddled together one last time. Neighbors might find entire households in spring, bodies frozen in each other's arms, as if trying to share a final warmth. Homes collapsed under heavy snow or raking ice storms. A roof failing at midnight could be fatal. Staggering through thigh-deep drifts to beg shelter didn't guarantee safety if others were at the breaking point. Disease loved the cold. Hunger weakened bodies. Cramped, smoky huts bred pneumonia and bronchitis. A cough in December could be a burial in January. And frostbite, the quiet, horror-blackened fingers, toes, ears. Some survived at the price of their limbs. A grim badge reading, "I made it," but winter took its share. What haunts most is the terrible normalcy. Each winter, some would not see thaw. Death was another neighbor, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Even so, peasants persisted, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life because as long as one ember glowed and one breath smoked in the air, there was still a fight. Looking back at those muddy, frost-bitten survivors, it's easy to see only cracked hands, frozen toes, smoke-choked rooms. But beneath the hardship lies something stronger, a legacy of raw ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They had no central heating, no thermal jackets, no memory foam cushions, often not even the assumption they'd reach spring. What they left was a blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every banked fire, every moss-packed gap testified to creativity under pressure. Faced with the impossible, they adapted, learning from land, from each other, from lessons carved by brutal winters. Their communities rested on more than common fields. They rested on shared survival, watching the sick, pooling food when stores ran thin, trusting that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you tomorrow. Their faith, too, was endurance woven into daily life, not just from fear, but from hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be warmer and brighter, that after 100 dark nights, spring would return, and life would push through frozen earth. And somehow it did. Because of their sacrifices, those unglamorous victories of one more night, one more storm later generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they moved humanity forward, enduring winters their forebears barely survived until warmth became expectation instead of dream. Their blood, sweat, and cleverness are stitched invisibly into our lives. Every cozy blanket, every heated room, every lazy winter evening with tea. All of it trails back to countless peasants refusing the cold. So when the wind claws at your double-paned windows, spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn did not enter the world crowned or flanked by armies. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with formidable ties. In the grand tide of Tudor society, her birth barely rippled. Yet from modest beginnings, something extraordinary took root, a life that would tilt English history. From early on, Anne stood apart not for riches, but for her mind, clever, spirited, magnetic. Sensing her promise, her family sent her abroad, where her true education began. She first served Margaret of Austria in the glittering Netherlandish court, an opportunity few English girls could dream of, absorbing diplomacy, polished manners, and the subtleties of European politics. But France sharpened her brilliance. In the sophisticated circles of Queen Claude and Marguerite of Navarre, she learned the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, wit. While others perfected embroidery, Anne mastered conversation, intrigue, and the art of commanding attention without seeming to seek it. Returning to England in the early 1520s, she was a rarity. A woman whose continental sophistication matched the ambition of a rising English house. Not a conventional beauty, her admirers admitted as much, but arresting, dark, intelligent eyes, a quick, musical voice, purposeful grace beneath layers of courtly poise. She didn't merely enter rooms, she altered their gravity. In an age when women's fates were often sealed by birth and marriage, Anne refused quiet obscurity. She had seen how charm and intellect could wield power, and meant to use it at home. Still young, keen, ambitious, untested history was already stirring around her. She was no longer just Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a player in a larger game, one soon to engulf the crown. Back at the English court, Anne was unlike anyone its nobles had known. In a garden of pale, modest English roses, she was a thunderstorm-charged, unpredictable, impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, bold eyes and quick wit contrasted sharply with the compliant ladies of Henry VIII's court. She began as maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, yet even there her presence flickered like a candle too bright to snuff. She danced with grace, spoke French as if native, and laughed with a confidence few dared. Men noticed, women whispered. The court hummed about the striking Boleyn girl. Soon she drew the most perilous gaze of all the king. Henry was no stranger to flirtation. His court teemed with whispers and secret trysts. But Anne was different. She did not swoon at compliments or tumble into his arms. She teased, she parried, she refused. The king, accustomed to instant devotion, was captivated. The more she held the line, the deeper he fell. Letters flew, love, frustration, longing. Henry offered the role of royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial station at court. Anne said no. She would not be a forgettable conquest. If he wanted her, he must wed her. It was a gamble so audacious, it stunned the court. Henry was already married. Catherine was beloved, and her nephew was the Holy Roman Emperor. To reach Anne, the king would have to defy the church itself. Anne didn't flinch. She'd lived where queens wielded soft power from behind fans and smiles. She knew the danger and intended to win. In candlelit halls, Anne chose not just to be admired, but to bend destiny and England with her. What began as scorching flirtation became a national crisis. Henry was not merely smitten. He was obsessed and ready to upend centuries. His wish to marry Anne met a minor obstacle: his existing marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Dignified and resilient, Catherine refused to step aside. She had been his faithful wife for 2 decades. In the eyes of God and England, she was queen. Divorce was scandalous, nearly unthinkable. Yet Henry pressed his claim that their union was cursed, as Catherine had once been married to his brother Arthur. Never mind the papal dispensation that had permitted it. Now Henry insisted only annulment could save his soul. Anne played her part shrewdly encouraging, yet reserved. Every glance and word measured. She was aiming not for a wedding, but for a crown. The court fractured. Some courtiers courted Anne's favor. Others clung to Catherine. Diplomats wrote furiously to Rome. Foreign rulers rattled sabers. Henry's advisors grew uneasy. Months bled into years. Henry barraged the Pope, prodded lawyers for loopholes, and learned Rome would not bend. Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, was too powerful. Still, Henry pushed against counsel, tradition, and law. What began as courtship became a challenge to the structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just capturing a king. She was dragging a kingdom into unknown waters. There would be no turning back. After nearly 7 grueling years of maneuver and scandal, Anne's wager paid off. In January 1533, she secretly wed Henry VIII Bold, given that Rome still recognized Catherine. By June, she was crowned at Westminster Abbey. It should have been triumph, yet London's cheers were mixed. Some celebrated, others prayed for Catherine. Many wondered whether this dazzling, daring queen portended blessing or curse. Anne entered not as beloved, but as storm. Unlike the humble, pious Catherine, Anne was provocative and politically sharp. She wore bold colors, commanded with quick intelligence, and made enemies quickly. Her position looked secure, yet hung by a thread. All depended on a male heir. She knew it. Early pregnancy brought joy and certainty until September 1533, when she delivered a daughter, Elizabeth. Anne masked her disappointment with poise, promising a son next time. Henry was less composed. Doubt crept in. For a while, Anne's star still burned. She reshaped court, elevated family, and an unprecedented honor was anointed with oil reserved for kings. Ambassadors sought her favor. Alliances shifted around her. Henry moved England away from Rome, making himself head of a new church, so Anne's crown could not be questioned. Yet even amid triumph, clouds gathered. Friends whispered, rivals circled, and Henry, restless, began to look past the woman who had remade his realm. She had won the throne. Keeping it would demand more than charm or love. Cracks widened. Pressure for a son mounted. Elizabeth thrived, but Henry's hopes sought a boy. Pregnancies came. Heartbreak followed. Miscarriages that sapped Anne's strength and spirit. Each loss chipped at her foundations. Henry's devotion cooled. Her sharpness and defiance, once irresistible, now grated. Outside, enemies swarmed. Catherine's partisans never forgave. Commoners muttered slurs and blamed Anne for the break with Rome. Then came Jane Seymour, quiet, yielding everything Anne was not. As Anne's light dimmed, Jane drew Henry's gaze. Anne fought to recover. Promises, attention, pleas. But the king was already imagining life beyond the woman for whom he'd sundered a kingdom. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the tide and began quietly assembling her ruin. Accusations, rumors, witnesses' knives, newly sharpened. Past victories meant little. Only fresh success counted. The queen who shattered a kingdom was about to discover how swiftly a kingdom could shatter her. Her foes didn't bring armies. They brought whispers and carefully honed lies. Cromwell, seeking favor and stability, offered Henry an exit that would not humiliate him. Not divorce, but disgrace. The charges were monstrous. Adultery, incest, treason. Courtly banter was twisted into damning testimony. Confessions were squeezed by torture. Even Anne's brother, George, was seized. The case was riddled with contradictions, but in Henry's court, truth was whatever he required. Anne appealed to memory and love. No use. The man who tore England apart for her would not meet her eyes. In May 1536, she was taken to the Tower. As the gate fell shut, she knew. No queen-only prisoner. The game she'd mastered now caged her. Tried before peers who owed her their rise, Anne faced theater dressed as justice. Adultery with several men, treason, conspiracy. The unthinkable made spectacle. She answered with the same lucid fire that had once won the king, denying each charge with precision, reminding them of her anointing, loyalty, and sacrifices. It changed nothing. The verdict had been inked before she entered. Witnesses coerced or bribed contradicted themselves. Evidence was gossamer. Guilty, they said. George and the others condemned. Anne would lose her head, merciful, beside the traitor's fate of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Pale but unbroken, she stood straight, declaring herself ready to die and praying for mercy on her soul. The doors closed. The court exhaled. They thought the storm was ending. They did not see they were fixing her forever in tragedy and legend. Returned to the Tower, Anne prepared hours of prayer on cold stone, hands clenched, voice steady. She confessed to no crimes. She feared death little, she said, but prayed her end might bring peace to the realm and mercy to her daughter. Her few loyal ladies wept in private. Anne comforted them. She even joked darkly she'd be remembered as the queen who lost her head humor as defiance. Henry showed no mercy. His attention had already shifted to Jane Seymour. Even before the date was set, he arranged his next wedding. On May 18, 1536, Anne learned she would die at dawn. She slept little. She prayed, seeking forgiveness for those who wronged her, perhaps for her own pride. Henry arranged a French swordsman swift, cleaner than an axe, a small courtesy purchased for conscience more than for Anne. At first light she dressed with care, dark gray damask trimmed with fur, crimson kirtle beneath colors of dignity and sacrifice. Hair pinned and capped, she stood ready to meet the blade with grace. In the tower's chill mist, Anne Boleyn Queen, mother, survivor, stepped forward. No tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage. On May 19th, 1536, she mounted the scaffold within the tower. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a handful of witnesses, hushed, as though the stones held their breath. She looked thinner, pale, but composed. No hysterics, no sobbing. The same fierce dignity that once rattled a kingdom. She spoke briefly, carefully. No accusations, no defense. Only a prayer for the king's health and prosperity. It stunned even those who came to see her fall. The French headsman advanced. Anne knelt upright, hands folded, eyes lifted. A white cloth bound her gaze. The sword flashed, one silent, merciful stroke, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history maker, was gone. Buried quickly in an unmarked grave inside the tower, laid in an arrow chest for lack of a coffin. The queen crowned in gold vanished without ceremony. Yet her story didn't end in cold earth. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child who disappointed a king, rose to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Elizabeth, whose reign flowered with art, power, and reach, carried her mother's keen mind and resilience. Anne had changed England's course. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall proved even queens could be cast aside. Through Elizabeth, her legacy blazed brighter than any crown she wore. She won a kind of immortality, not by survival, but by indelible impact. By the early 1770s, America's colonies simmered like a pot left too long to boil. The bond with Britain, the proud mother country, had curdled into resentment, suspicion, and anger. It didn't start with tea. The Stamp Act had taxed everything from newspapers to playing cards. The Townshend Acts followed. Duties on paper, glass, paint. Each law, crafted thousands of miles away by a parliament where colonists had no seat, was another spark in dry brush. At first came polite petitions and fiery pamphlets. Assemblies drafted protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson thundered about liberty and rights. The frustration deepened. Britain wasn't listening. Worse, it didn't care. Now and then, noise worked. The Stamp Act fell. But every victory was followed by new measures, new taxes, new slights. It wasn't the money. It never really was. The sums were small by British standards. It was the principle. Taxation without consent. Subjects, not citizens. Possessions, not partners. Boston became the pulsing heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty grew louder. In 1770, British troops fired on civilians. The Boston Massacre. Blood stained the stones. Trust was gone. By 1773, the colonies teetered. The final insult would come quietly in crates of tea. That night, as chests bobbed in Boston Harbor's cold waters, the world bent toward change. Parliament misread the moment. Convinced the colonies would accept cheaper tea, it passed the Tea Act, meant to rescue the East India Company and reaffirm Parliament's right to tax. On paper, it looked generous. The company could sell directly, cut out middlemen, slash prices fine tea for a few pennies less. What could go wrong? Everything. The problem wasn't cost, it was consent. The Tea Act left the hated duty in place. To accept the bargain was to accept Parliament's power to tax without representation. For many Americans, that was unthinkable. A surrender of the very liberties they had defended. For over a decade, that's how it felt. Word of the Tea Act flashed through the colonies like wildfire. Merchants fumed, seeing a monopoly poised to crush local trade. Patriots burned at the hidden message. The Crown still believed it could do as it pleased. In Boston, the reaction was fiercest. Already scarred by the massacre and years of hardship, Bostonians saw the Tea Act for what it was, a trap dressed up as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a point of honor, a litmus test of loyalty to liberty. Crowds swelled at public meetings, newspapers blazed with rhetoric. The Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized boycotts, vowing that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or sipped on American soil. Across the colonies, ships bearing the disputed cargo were turned away. From New York to Charleston, the message rang clear: we will not be bought. But Boston's fate twisted differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver dropped anchor and stayed. Royal officials insisted the tea be landed. Colonists refused. A deadlock tightened, taut as a drawn bowstring. The strain was unbearable. One act would break it and alter history. As those tea ships sat stubbornly in Boston Harbor, the city became a powder keg. Each day without resolution ratcheted the tension higher. Boston wasn't merely resisting, it was bracing for a fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists argued next steps. The Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere, moved quickly, posting notices to boycott British tea and holding raucous meetings that packed farmers, artisans, and merchants shoulder to shoulder. The Old South Meeting House became the movement's nerve center. Thousands jammed the timbered hall, breath fogging, voices rising in defiance. Resolutions passed, speeches thundered, tempers boiled. Every vote against unloading was a hammer blow to British authority. Yet the clock ticked. By law, imports like tea had to be landed, and the duty paid within 20 days, or customs would seize the cargo and collect by force. The Sons of Liberty knew, once that tax was paid, even under protest, the principle was lost. This wasn't merely tea anymore. It was a choice. Accept subject status without rights, or stand and fight for the future. Meanwhile, Governor Thomas Hutchinson dug in. He refused to let the ships depart. Without unloading, law must be obeyed. Mob rule be damned. The standoff became a spectacle. Everyone sensed a storm's hush, the cold, sharp stillness before lightning. One spark would set it off. Somewhere in those crowded streets, a decision congealed. A plan meant to echo across oceans and empires. December 16th, 1773, dawned gray and cold over Boston, a city teetering on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, tea ships had sat like ticking bombs. Now the final deadline had arrived. British law required the tea be landed and taxed within 20 days, or officials could seize it and call in troops. Everyone knew the stakes. If the tea came ashore, the principle unraveled. If they yielded even once, the cause of rights and liberty would fray. That morning, thousands from Boston and beyond packed the Old South Meeting House, the largest hall in town. Some trudged miles through icy countryside to attend. Men spilled into the streets, straining to catch the fiery speeches bouncing off the wooden rafters. Samuel Adams, iron voice of rebellion, presided. Speaker after speaker denounced the Tea Act, railed against tyranny, and urged action. But uncertainty hung heavy. What could be done without igniting war? How to stop the tea without unleashing brutal reprisal? Late in the day, riders clattered in. Hutchinson wouldn't budge. The ships would not sail without unloading. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, the king's law enforced. The crowd buzzed with fury. The walls seemed to shudder. Then Samuel Adams spoke the words that ended debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple sentence, its meaning unmistakable. Petitions were over. Action would speak. Outside, a wild whoop pierced the gloom, the signal. Men smeared soot on their faces, threw on blankets and feathers in rough imitation of mohawks. It wasn't disguise. It was symbol a message no one could miss. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer not with words, but defiance. As twilight settled over Boston, the quiet streets stirred. Figures moved in shadow, ordinary men, cloaked in rough blankets, faces blackened, a few feathers tucked in. They weren't fooling anyone into believing they were real Mohawks. The costume was a declaration shedding old identities to take a fiercer stand. By the dozens, they headed to Griffin's Wharf, where the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver lay at anchor. Harbor water heaved dark and cold, winter air biting sharp. There was no brawl, no drunken din. This was no riot. It was a mission, calm and ruthless. With hatchets and clubs, the disguised men swarmed aboard, overwhelming the few crew still present. No sailors were harmed. They were pushed aside and watched in stunned silence as the work began. Chests were split with practiced blows. The fragrance of fresh tea lifted into the cold. Others heaved the crates into the black water. Heavy splashes echoed across the harbor. Chest after chest, 342 in all, was smashed and dumped until the water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. On the wharf, spectators stood hushed, amazed. British guards nearby did not intervene, whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalation, no one can say. Some accounts hint that even among loyalists, there was a silent recognition. Something had shifted. Nothing would stop it tonight. Discipline held. No cargo was stolen. No valuables were pilfered. Only the tea, the hated emblem of oppression, was targeted. In a hungry town, the protest could have turned to looting. It did not. When it ended, the harbor looked like a vast, churning kettle filled with shattered chests and soaking leaves. The sea's brine mingled with the sharp tang of tea, steeping the night air in a bittersweet scent. Work done, the men melted back into alleys and back streets, leaving no names, no leaders, no claim, only the unmistakable stamp of revolution. By morning, Boston smelled of salt and tea. The story flew by word of mouth, letter, broadside. By midday, apprentices and merchants alike knew. Opinions split fast. Patriots swelled with pride. Ordinary men had defied the world's mightiest empire and struck for liberty. Loyalists and moderates were horrified. Destruction of property was reckless, dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line they could not retreat from? Governor Hutchinson raged, furious at the wreckage and at the message. If the king's authority could be mocked so brazenly here, where next? British officials reeled. They expected protests and boycotts, maybe another riot. They did not expect disciplined rebels calmly destroying royal property worth a fortune without breaking a single window. The captains of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver could only watch as their cargo slipped beneath the waves. The ledger would tally the loss at over $10,000 a fortune. But the real loss was not in pounds. It was in trust, in loyalty, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled by consent. As the tea sank, something else surfaced, a shared, undeniable truth. The age of polite protest was ending. A reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready. When word crossed the Atlantic, London's response was swift and furious. This wasn't protest, it was rebellion, a brazen dare to royal authority. King George III reportedly went cold with anger. Parliament, already exasperated by years of disobedience, exploded. Punish Boston and warn the rest, that was the cry. The result, laws so harsh, colonists named them the Intolerable Acts. First came the Boston port. Act 1, brutal stroke shuttered the city's lifeline until the tea was repaid and order restored. Ships could neither enter nor depart. Trade died. Goods dried up. The bustling docks felt eerily still. punishment didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped self-rule, placing the colony under the king's appointees. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials to be tried in Britain, telegraphing impunity. Troops were quartered throughout Boston to make force visible. The message was blunt. Rebellion would be crushed. Liberty was a luxury the crown no longer tolerated. But London's hammer blow had an unintended effect. It forged sympathy into unity. News of Boston's suffering, its port closed, its people starving under martial rule, stirred righteous anger in every colony. Wagon loads of food and supplies rolled in. Letters of support and secret councils stitched the fractious colonies closer. What had been Massachusetts' crisis was becoming America's. In trying to make an example, Britain made a symbol, a rallying cry. Flickers of resistance flared into a spreading blaze. There would be no easy dousing. The shock waves ran far beyond Massachusetts. Outrage hardened into something more dangerous to Britain: unity. For years, the colonies had behaved like quarrelsome cousins, divided by geography, religion, trade rivalries. But when Parliament slammed Boston's harbor shut and gutted its self-government, a realization took hold. If Boston could be crushed, any colony could. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response snapped into motion. Wagons of food and supplies clattered toward Boston. Town meetings crackled with fury. Printers worked through the night to spread the news. The fight was no longer Boston's alone. It was everyone's. In September 1774, the unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Representatives from 12 colonies gathered to craft a united response. Washington, Patrick Henry, John and Samuel Adams, once regional figures, now stood as architects of a growing movement. Officially, most still sought reconciliation, mutual respect under the crown. But beneath the courteous petitions, a deeper truth took root. The colonies could no longer stand apart. Congress agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods, pledged mutual defense, and declared that an attack on one would be an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses, words once whispered went public. Unity, resistance, liberty. The crown had aimed to crush rebellion. Instead, it welded the colonies together. A people, despite their differences, began to think of themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution no longer stirred. They gathered into storm. The night the tea went under, it wasn't just crates that sank. It was the illusion that loyalty could hold forever. The Tea Party lit a spark no king, army, or distant parliament could snuff. In the months that followed, that spark caught. Petitions hardened into open resistance. Militias drilled in daylight. Storehouses filled with powder and shot. Men who once toasted King George whispered revolution where they'd raised their cups. Boston stood as symbol battered, unbowed. The tighter Britain squeezed, the more the colonies slipped through its fingers. Every ship passing Boston's silent, sealed harbor reminded all. Tyranny had met its match in American defiance. The intolerable acts were meant to scare the colonies into submission. Instead, they made a martyr city and a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, people saw their fates bound together. This wasn't about tea anymore. It was about survival, identity, freedom. By spring 1775, tension boiled outside Boston. At Lexington and Concord, British troops sent to seize weapons met farmers with muskets. Ordinary men ready to defend their rights with fire. The first shots of the revolution rang out, their line traceable back to a cold night when men chose principle over profit and dumped a fortune into the sea. The Tea Party showed that revolution doesn't always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it begins with a small band standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. In rejecting the tea, the colonists rejected an empire. The road ahead would be bloody, bitter, uncertain. But one truth had crystallized over Boston Harbor. The colonies were no longer mere subjects. They were something new, dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just beginning. Long before the pyramids of Giza, before Mesopotamian cities thrummed, before Stonehenge crowned its plain, there was Corral. Hidden in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, Corral rose in silent majesty nearly 5 millennia ago, then slipped into near-total oblivion, swallowed by sand and forgotten. For centuries, the world didn't know it existed. The Supi Valley, where Corral thrived, seems an unlikely cradle for civilization. Parched, spare, a river no more than a thin silver thread through rock and dust. To most, it looked inhospitable, abandoned by life. Yet here, amid desolation, one of humanity's earliest great cities took shape. Corral wasn't a scatter of huts or a passing trading post. It was a planned city sprawling over 150 acres. Pyramids, plazas, residences, ceremonial spaces, scale, purpose, vision. Complex society flowered centuries before Egyptians stacked stones into their own pyramids. The people of Corral did it without the wheel, without writing, without metal tools. They built with stone and earth on ingenuity, communal effort, and the raw will of human hands. For millennia, Corral's existence hid in plain sight. Travelers who saw the weathered mounds dotting the valley took them for natural hills carved by desert winds. No one dreamed that beneath the sand lay one of the world's oldest cities, predating those in our schoolbooks. Not until the late 20th century did archaeologists led by Ruth Shady expose the truth. What they brushed from the dust would rewrite the American past and force a rethink of civilization's birth. Corral had risen, flourished, fallen in silence. Now, after ages, its stones speak again of a peaceful, brilliant people who built complexity and wonder where life itself seemed impossible. And their story was only beginning. At first glance, the Supi looks like a place where life falters, harsh winds over endless sand and stone, sun baking the ground into cracked plates. Water is scarce, the river a meandering thread clinging to survival. To the untrained eye, wasteland. But the people of Corral saw a canvas. They recognized the river modest, but lifeblood. With patience, ingenuity, and grit, they turned an unforgiving place into a thriving oasis of culture. Their first victory was agriculture. They tamed seasonal floods, carving simple, brilliant canals that carried water across the valley floor. Where others saw dust, they coaxed green cotton, beans, squash, guava, sweet potatoes. Cotton, especially, became treasure spun into fishing nets and textiles, fueling trade with coastal villages, stitching bonds far beyond the desert. Survival required balance. Corral worked with nature, not against it. Homes and plazas of stone and earth were designed to withstand scorching heat and rare punishing rains. They watched stars and seasons, timing harvests with astronomers' care. Trade became the city's veins and arteries, dried fish, cotton, fruit, crafted goods flowing up and down the coast. In return came shells from the Pacific, stones from the Andes, ideas from afar. They were not isolated, they were connected. In a land where survival seemed unlikely, Corral flourished through intelligence, innovation, and community partnering with the desert, learning its rhythms, respecting its power. Against the odds, Corral blossomed into a beacon of civilization and was only beginning to rise. Lifting from the desert like ancient guardians, Corral's pyramids overturn much of what we thought we knew about early America. These weren't crude heaps. They were deliberate, massive works of architecture vision, organization, ambition made stone. The centerpiece, the pyramid mare, stretched over 450 feet and rose nearly 60 feet above the desert floor. A feat on par with early wonders. Built of stone, mud, and woven reed bags packed with rubble, it was engineered to endure both climate and the earthquakes that rattle the region, and endure it did, standing against wind and time for nearly 5,000 years. But Corral's pyramids weren't tombs. Unlike Egypt's burial complexes, these served as centers of ceremony, power, and public life. Temples and gathering spaces crowned their summits, reached by broad, elegant stairs. Fires once burned atop those platforms. Rituals unfolded beneath the Peruvian sky. At their feet, vast sunken plazas opened, arenas for worship, civic meetings, and celebration. The city's design spoke of community and order, of people connected to each other and the cosmos. Residences fanned out around the monuments, priests, officials, artisans, farmers. The pyramids seem aligned with celestial events, sunrises, solstices, star cycles. For Corral, architecture was practical and spiritual mathematical, cosmic. Walk the stones today, and awe is hard to escape. Raised without metal tools, without wheels, without beasts of burden, yet shaped with symmetry, scale, and astonishing precision. These pyramids weren't built for vanity or war. They linked earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity, and they still whisper across the sands. What sets Corral apart is profound. No weapons in the sands, no defensive walls around the plazas, no mass graves of conquest or civil strife. Unlike kingdoms that rose through war, Corral seems built on peace. It's a revelation. This was a civilization that flourished through cooperation, trade, and shared belief. Energy went not into armies, but into architecture, astronomy, music, and communal life. Plazas and pyramids weren't victory monuments. They were centers of celebration, worship, governance. This was a culture that gathered instead of conquering, negotiated instead of destroying. Trade was its lifeblood. Cotton spun into nets, traded for coastal fish. In return came protein and exotic goods, colorful shells, precious highland stones, rare fruits from distant valleys. Networks stitched the region together, binding far-flung communities into a peaceful web of mutual benefit with Carol at the hub. Religion and ceremony helped keep harmony. Grand public spaces and sunken courts were stages for rituals that united people under shared beliefs. Music filled these gatherings, flutes of condor bone, drums of deer, hide soundscapes echoing across the desert, tying lives to something greater. Leadership seems to have rested on spiritual authority and civic organization more than might. Coordinating vast construction, seasonal agriculture, and trade agreements required capable hands without leaving the scars of war. In an ancient world defined so often by conflict, Corral shines as exception, a reminder that civilization need not rise on the broken backs of the conquered. It can be built by collaboration, creativity, and trust. Carol stones still hum with the echoes of a living world sound, ceremony, spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual were woven into its heartbeat. Archaeologists uncovered a trove of instruments, flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, whistles from antler, small drums stretched with hides, crafted with care, tuned to carry across wide plazas. In a world without writing, music spoke the soul's language. Picture it, dusk's low drum thrum, flutes keening like desert wind, feet stamping in sunken plazas as hundreds gathered under fading light. Fires crackled atop pyramids. Priests in intricate woven garments chanted to river, earth, and stars. In those moments, Corral was not just a city, it was a symphony. Urban design puts ritual at the core, grand plazas as stages for communal rites, sunken circles like amphitheaters focusing sight and sound, pyramids looming above as sacred mountains linking earth and heaven. Ceremonies likely marked seasons, plantings, harvests, celestial cycles. Music was not mere entertainment. It bridged people and nature, the known and the beyond. No violent murals, no bloodthirsty war gods. Corral's spiritual world seems one of harmony, celebration, reverence. Even today, when desert wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost hear the faint strains, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty and connection in the harshest sands. Corral was also a marvel of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity in a brutal landscape. Without metal, wheels, or draft animals, they shaped a stone and earth city that has endured for nearly 5 millennia. Massive pyramids rose from the desert, built with great stones hauled across the valley in reed bags, ingenious baskets woven from riverbank plants, strong enough for heavy loads. Layer upon layer, they stacked stone and filled cores with rubble structures designed to withstand not just time, but nature's wrath. Earthquakes strike this region, yet Corral's monuments survived. How? By mastering seismic design, flexible construction, layered fill, broad foundations, rounded corners to absorb and dissipate shocks. Engineering born not from books, but from intimate knowledge of the ground. Water mastery was another quiet triumph. In a desert, they crafted sophisticated irrigation channels and canals guiding the river's flow to fields, keeping crops alive through dry seasons. Not a drop wasted. The city plan itself shows brilliant urban thinking major structures aligned to astronomical points, sunken plazas with precise geometry, serving as celestial instruments for tracking seasons essential to survival. Residential, administrative, and ceremonial zones were laid out in harmony, balancing daily life and sacred purpose. They built for generations. Modern engineers marvel at Corral's resilience, proof that greatness isn't technology alone, but understanding nature and working with it. These stones have ridden out storms, quakes, and time-silent testimony to dreams engineered into desert sands. For centuries, Corral thrived, a beacon of peace, music, trade, and design. Then, quietly, it emptied. No charred ruins mark its fall, no shattered walls, no mass graves. Corral simply faded, plazas emptied, pyramids surrendered to drifting sand, flutes and drums went still. Why did they leave? The question lingers like a ghost over the Supi. Some scholars point to climate-long droughts crippling agriculture. Without the river's gift, fields withered, and trade dependent on surplus faltered. The balance they'd struck with the desert may have tipped beyond recovery. Others see shifting trade routes, new powers on the coast, and in the highlands dimming Corral's influence. Perhaps cotton, fish, produce no longer sustained its central role, and commerce slowly bled away. Still others whisper of internal strains, politics, religious upheaval, simple exhaustion after centuries of growth. Even peaceful societies can fracture when survival turns uncertain. Whatever the cause, departure seems gradual, families drifting to greener valleys and stronger rivers. Children who once ran across Corral's plazas grew up telling stories of the city behind them, tales that faded into legend. The desert reclaimed what humans made, sand scoured stone, flutes lay buried. A vibrant civilization became a field of sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Corral lay hidden, a whisper under the dunes, waiting. In the late 20th century, that whisper became a voice. In the 1999s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Supi, drawn by the sense that these hills held secrets. What they found rewrote the timeline. Brush by brush, layers lifted, Walls of cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, pyramids, a city older than anyone imagined. Radiocarbon dates confirmed the unbelievable. Over 4,600 years old, thriving alongside the earliest Mesopotamian and Egyptian centers. The discovery shook archaeology. Before Corral, scholars believed the Americas civilizations blossomed later, in the shadow of old world empires. Corral proved otherwise. The hemisphere had independently birthed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and social order long before the Inca or Moche. Shady's team uncovered more than stone life's remnants: instruments, fishing nets, textiles, Huipu knot records, offerings to the gods. Each artifact told of vision, intelligence, creativity. Carroll's rediscovery wasn't just academic, it was a resurrection. A civilization that slept under desert skies now stood revealed, its plazas kissed again by the same winds that once carried flute song and children's laughter. Today, Corral is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building, belonging, believing. The sands hid it well, but the stones endured, waiting for someone to see, to listen, to remember. Corral stands as a silent giant, reminding us that civilization's roots reach deeper than we knew. Among its pyramids and plazas, ancient stones whisper a story that reshapes our understanding. Not conquest and bloodshed, but harmony, ingenuity, hope. Long before Greece, Rome, or even Egypt's glory, Corral's people built something extraordinary. Pyramids without wheels, star maps without writing, a thriving society of trade, music, ritual, and engineering, without carving war scars into the land. In an era defined by conflict, Corral offers another vision: connection over conquest, knowledge over domination. It proves that complexity need not bloom from violence, that greatness isn't counted in marching armies, but in communities that gather to build, create, and dream. Its legacy stretches beyond the Supi's dry sands, challenging the myth of a single cradle that urban life and monumental stone belonged first to the old world. Corral shows that human invention rose independently, in many places different hands, the same desires: to endure, to celebrate, to reach for the divine. Walk the ruins today, and you can almost hear it: the drum's pulse, the low hum of flutes, traders bargaining, children laughing beneath a sky of endless stars. Their lives and dreams are etched into the earth's bones. Corral teaches that even when cities fall, their spirit can persist, sleeping under sands, waiting to inspire again. In humanity's long timeline, Corral shines not merely as relic, but as beacon, proof that in the harshest deserts, under the heaviest sands, seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can root and raise a world that reaches for the stars.